is Nathan Furr. I'm a professor of strategy at INSEAD. I started to wrestle with an issue that bothered me, and that is, in our field we've adopted the very familiar explore-exploit dichotomy that March talked about in his 1991 paper. But the problem with that dichotomy, as good as it is that we kind of make this assumption that all exploratory activities fall under this one umbrella, and the individuals are these rational actors engaging in this rational calculation about exploring versus exploiting. And if you've looked at innovation, you know it's not that way. And so we held a PDW to ask an important question. We've seen a behavioral revolution or turn in other fields, behavioral economics, behavioral strategy, behavioral marketing and operations, but we haven't seen that same turn in the domain of innovation. So we asked the question, does the domain of innovation, could the domain of innovation benefit from the more systematic application of a behavioral lens to the topic of innovation? And how? What would that look like? And I would say in the PDW, we came up with some fairly interesting discussions. I'd say in general, the assessment was yes, of course the domain of innovation could benefit. We acknowledge that there have been some academics who have done some really good work in this space, Mary Benner, Mary Tripsis, and many others who have done a great job applying a cognitive lens or a behavioral lens to the space of innovation. But we would define behavioral innovation as the application of the cognitive sciences to understand the microprocesses of innovation and its biases, and to develop the mechanisms and remedies for that. And what we discussed in the PDW is a set of opportunities. Whereas behavioral economics tends to focus fairly narrowly on developing biases, nudges, and aspirations, we think the opportunity in innovation is to take a much broader view of the entire innovation process, from the generation and search processes to evaluation processes, which ideas will we pursue, to the development and the resource allocation behind those things. So to look more broadly at the whole process, number one. To number two, situate it more carefully in the organization. A lot of existing literature and debates, really if you boil them down, are a debate about creators, scientists, versus consumers. As J.P. Eggers called it, a demand pull versus demand push. You know, demand pull is you focus on consumers and somehow innovation arrives out of that. Demand push is you look at technology, its evolution, somehow innovation comes out of that. But what's really missing more often in our discussions is the manager and the organization. So number two is to think about it, the manager through a behavioral lens more carefully and how they evaluate and their decision processes. And Justin Berg from Stanford participated, and Rory McDonald from Harvard, and they both talked about managerial, the influence of behavioral forces on managers as they evaluate ideas and allocate resources. I'd say the third piece is to integrate more perspectives. So for example, neuroscience offers all these potential opportunities to really understand the micromechanisms of the innovation process. It's hard to do. And so we had Daniela, who was there attending, and from ETH Zurich, and she was talking about her successes and challenges and the opportunities of applying, say, neuroscience to the study of innovation. And I'd say the last area which we touched upon is, what are the remedies for these biases? So one critique we could maybe make of behavioral economics is we have a long list of biases, but not a deep understanding of the mechanisms and the remedies. And I think in the innovation domain and a behavioral innovation view, we want to understand, if possible, some of the mechanisms and remedies better. It's interesting to see that, you know, many times leaders in organizations say we want more innovative ideas, we want more disruptive ideas. But when you actually look at the selection processes, the search and selection processes, they search for and select for rather incremental things. I just heard a story of a big industrial conglomerate set up 10 teams to search for disruptive ideas, and they came back with incremental Me Too stuff. And I've been working on an article saying, well, how do we break through? How do we push the thinking and the selection processes so you can get these bigger things? And just for fun, one of the things I've seen a number of companies do, one of my collaborators has done, he's actually used science fiction. So what he's done is he's given the technology and customer data from the company to a panel of science fiction writers and asked this panel to come up with stories of what the future could look like in 5 to 10 years. Then they iterate those stories down to a story that makes sense, and then they present that story back, and usually in a comic book format, to the leadership team. And what it does is it helps them, it's kind of a crazy story, but underneath it, if we look at the behavioral mechanisms, what it's doing is finding a way for the organization to break out of that trap of local thinking we're all tied into, and then create a mechanism to overcome the fear that's associated with the uncertainty. The story helps them suspend their disbelief enough and exit the evaluative, the comic helps them exit the evaluative mindset and get into oh, we could do this mindset. How do we do this kind of mindset? And so I believe that there's remedies out there. I mean, I know that's not one of the things we academics like to talk about too much. We want to understand the mechanisms, but not the remedies. But I think if we understand the mechanisms, designing the proper remedies becomes so much easier for practice, rather than letting them kind of just come up with stuff randomly.